Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Angela Dresselhaus, and I'm very pleased today to introduce today's vision speaker. Lauren Smith is an information specialist at the Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services in Glasgow, Scotland. She's been working on the development of the IRIS Evidence Search and Summary Service since late 2017. Lauren is a qualified library and information professional with experience supporting a range of sectors, including public, school, academic, and healthcare. She's strongly committed to the information profession, particularly supporting people to make informed decisions in their study, work, and life through reflective practice. Lauren's PhD was completed in 2016, and it focused on information experiences in the context of political engagement. She has been involved in social research in several areas, such as information use and evaluation, agency and social justice, privacy, equitable access to education, hate speech and social media, and LGBTQ bullying. Lauren is particularly interested in the role of knowledge exchange and the public engagement in getting knowledge into practice and questions around the negotiation of authority of evidence, knowledge, and information in interdisciplinary contexts. So welcome, Lauren.
Thanks very much. So I'd really like to thank the NASIG team for inviting me to speak at this event. Particularly thanks to Violetta Illick, the programme planner, for helping with all the logistics, and to everyone working behind the scenes to make everything run smoothly. It's been a fantastic conference, and I hope you've all been enjoying it. So, as has been mentioned, I've been involved in the library information kind of area in various communities since around 2008. So although I'm not really a new professional, I've not been working in libraries for that long, I've been doing a lot of studying, but a lot of engaging with different communities and different issues. So the talk takes a little bit of a divergence from the abstract, because my original intention was to focus more directly on work in systems librarianship. And then as I was writing it, I realised that isn't my area of expertise, and I'm not going to stand here and teach you to suck eggs. So I'm going to share some of my experiences, and perhaps hopefully you can kind of see how what I've been doing in certain ways you could apply in your own practice and might be useful to you. So it's my hope that you'll find this interesting, but you'll also see it as broadly relevant to what you're doing, and maybe hopefully even be encouraged to go out there and do some cool stuff yourself. So I want to talk about one core aspect to library and information work that I think should be a part of what we're all doing. We should all be aiming to improve access to information through tackling a wide range of different challenges in the vast and varied parts of the profession. I don't have a systems or serials background. My background's more information literacy, with an interest in public libraries particularly. But from my time around you during this conference, I feel like we all seem to be interested in supporting people using our services to access information and use that information in powerful ways. Access to information is about more than being able to complete an academic assignment or book a holiday or find guidance in a particular area of your practice or work. It's about being able to exercise your rights in a civic sense and beyond. Without access to information and the power to make use of it, people don't have the agency they need to move around the world making informed choices. So it's my hope that there'll be three main themes coming across in what I'm talking about, and these are power, praxis, and privilege. I want to look at how people have been using the power that they have across various different parts of the library and information world, and look at and how working in these ways helps us become aware of the privilege that we have, acknowledge its existence, and then work accordingly to make conditions more equitable for the people that we serve and the people that we work with, and the people who we should be working with but currently aren't. So, don't know if anybody's familiar with the band Manic Street Preachers, but this is a lyric of theirs. And although I think it has some limitations in the way that it's used in the UK, this is often cited as, libraries gave us power, libraries are great in library advocacy. I do think, to an extent, this is true, and certainly there is the potential for this to happen. So, the outcome of improved access to information and knowledge is creating the conditions for people to make informed decisions. So, for example, if someone working in a public library can help a person use digital tools to contact their local or national representative, that's them using the power they have to support someone's civic engagement. If a school librarian can help a child struggling with their sexual or gender identity through access to books and websites that tell them they're not alone, and there's things that can help them thrive, then that's them using their power to help someone live a fuller and hopefully longer life. And this is some powerful stuff, so I am quite romantic about this. But one thing that I see and hear a lot when I talk about this kind of thing is people saying that I can't do that because I don't have the power in my own workplace, or I'm not the right person to be doing that. I don't have a right to be asking questions or demanding things of my managers. And that makes me really sad. It makes me sad because I understand that it does feel like that a lot in the places that we work. And it makes me sad because I know that to some extent it is true. And it makes me sad because I think of all the amazing things we could be achieving if it didn't feel like that and if it wasn't true. And sometimes I seek solace on Twitter and I come across gems like Emily Drabinski's recent keynote at the Art Librarians Conference in London. And this really helps. So that's a part of the community that I'm involved in on Twitter, and it really does help kind of inform what I'm thinking about. Because she's so right. In so many instances, we have more power than we think that we do. I want to talk about a few areas where I think this is the case, and I hope it isn't too much of a hopscotch across a really wide landscape of library information work, and by the end of it we feel like maybe we could take a look at where there are points of tension or problems in the areas that we're all working in, and think about the power we could wield to make things better for the people that we serve, and the people that we work with, or the people that we should be working with. So this seems like an opportune moment to emphasise that what I'm talking about today and what I do in work has been massively influenced by a broad range of people in the library and information world. And its peripheries, many of whom I've never met, probably don't know I exist, but some of whom are my closest friends. And here are only some of them. And their thoughts and words have helped me think about power and the areas that we work in. And they've helped encourage me to do things I might not have been brave enough to do on my own, and to carry on when things are pretty sucky. So that's the point of what I'm talking about, that we don't have to go this alone. There are amazing communities out there, and NASIG seems to be one of them, and I'm really encouraged by what's going on and the connections people are making here, and that's really positive to see. So throughout the talk, we're considering some examples of how power is distributed unevenly in our services, how that limits our ability to work towards what could be considered socially just outcomes, talking about my experiences of engaging in Praxis as part of a wider community, how I found it helpful in my own work to try and address some of the issues of injustice and inequality perpetuated and shored up by the services that we are in charge of. I'm going to draw on some examples of the work that I've been doing for social care and support in Scotland, and some of the other great work going on in the UK. I want to talk about how being involved in communities has helped me learn, hear about issues more broadly than those affecting me at the end of my own nose, and how engaging with theory has helped the work that's being done. And I also want to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing in the UK that might resonate with you, that you may well have more experience of. So hopefully, by the end of this, there'll still be some time for questions and discussion, and maybe we can share some ideas. Okay, definitions. I'll try and skip this really quickly. So, power, how can we understand it? In the context of the talk, I'm understanding power as a set of relationships and distributions of agency and control that can be transformed to achieve more equitable outcomes. I'm considering how, through looking at challenges and change through a lens of power, we can start to think about how to affect change on different scales. So, revisiting Emily's recent talk, I think this is a perfect justification for exactly why we're well placed to look at where power is working and in what ways. We are the ones building these systems, we're the ones working with them, so we can see where there are points of tension and where there are problems and where things aren't working fairly. And this is where reading comes in. I think it's really important that we need to remember people have been dealing with these kinds of issues and challenges in our profession for a very long time and writing about them. And we can turn to that writing and thinking for history, background, understanding in a way that I don't have insight into in my limited career experience so far. Drawing on what theorists have written about power is useful in a way that this tweet from Carl Miller sums up, I think, really nicely. It's about us learning how to ask the right questions within our services so we can interpret what's happening, what impact our services might be having, for good or ill. It's really easy to get carried away with new ideas or to try to justify our existence by taking on more and more responsibility. But I think sometimes we benefit from slowing down, having a look around, taking a look back at our own history. We have a rich body of literature to draw on from within library and information history, and we have amazing communities raising really important ethical professional issues that should be listened to. And power's messy and it's complicated. So the power I'm talking about is not just between a service and its users, it's also between higher and lower ranking members in a workplace, or within organisations, across professional organisations. And power takes place on different scales. So I want to emphasise that even the little things we do are part of a larger whole, and whatever small thing we can be doing can contribute to a bigger good. And thinking about power where it exists and how it's distributed has helped me identify where I can make a difference. And I'll be talking about some examples of that and what I'm hoping it will achieve. So, critically reflecting on that power leads to thinking about agency, which is what abilities, skills, freedoms and dispositions are required to be able to make judgments and exercise choices. I first came across this concept when I was engaging with the CritLib community on Twitter, and it informed the direction of my doctoral research in terms of considering young people's political engagement and information use in terms of how it influences their agency. In the context of library and information services more broadly, we can think about it in terms of the agency that we have ourselves, or where our users may not have the agency required to affect change. It's a useful way of thinking about where power is situated and where it isn't evenly distributed. And where this power comes into play through action and agency is praxis, which is a useful way of thinking about the power that we have, what it can look like when we do something about trying to address those power imbalances in our critical and reflective work. And there are different ways of understanding praxis. Aristotle conceptualizes it as thoughtful, practical doing. Anne-Marie Lloyd refers to it as morally informed action. John Budd describes it as action that carries social and ethical implications and is not reducible to technical performance of tasks. And as Freire describes it, it's a continuous process of reflection and action. And here I have to acknowledge my healthy dollop of privilege, because we can't do good work without acknowledging that and crucially acting upon it. It's privilege that affords us the freedom to take action and use our own agency to turn knowledge into praxis, and which allows us to do so with minimal risk of harm. So in terms of different kinds of privilege, I'm thinking about these kinds of areas, and we have to acknowledge our privilege before we can most effectively support actions to achieve equitable outcomes. We need to realise, for example, that what we're choosing to fight for or to not fight for is often because it doesn't affect us personally. These kinds of things, economic, social, cultural capital, gender, sexuality, race, influence the context we're in and whether we're in a position to do something. I think they also ought to influence how much of a responsibility we feel towards one another. People afforded certain privileges in certain spaces have a responsibility towards those who don't have them, and this is where critical reflection comes in. So this is where theory can be really useful. It's where we can go to inform ourselves about what to be aware of, how to conduct ourselves when we're operating in spaces where there are power imbalances. The onus shouldn't be on marginalised people to educate us about how to make our systems, structures and services better individually. There's lots out there about what we need to be doing, and we need to be engaging with the writing in those areas. Right, that's definitions out of the way. So this is a bit where I tell you who the heck I am and what I'm doing. So I work in IRIS, which is a very small organisation that works with social services across Scotland to support the workforce, to make improvements in things like service delivery and evaluation. And the Evidence Search and Summary Service was set up in October 2017, so still pretty new. There are two of us. There's me and my colleague Annalise, and we've set up the service from scratch. So we've designed the service, identified key goals, aims, what outcomes we want to achieve, and we've been coming up with ideas about how that can work. So really the mission of what we're doing is to get knowledge into action in social services. In terms of what that looks like, we've been writing evidence searches and summaries, and we're in the process of writing a conversation opener toolkit, which can be used as part of online learning and doing drop-ins. So all of this has a kind of critical pedagogical spin, making use of the ACRL framework for information literacy. So that's been an interesting combo. So based, as I say, on the conversation opener toolkit, we're going to be doing drop-ins to support people with anything information literacy related. And the evidence searches and summaries themselves are designed to support the needs of individuals or organisations, but they're also all published open access online, and they've been proving really useful. So this is all taking place in Scotland, and Scotland's a bit weird at the minute. So there are lots of different organisations who deliver and regulate social services, which is public services, so local authorities, third sector, so various charities, and the private sector, who deliver things like services for people with disabilities, long-term conditions, mental health, palliative care, child protection, alcohol and substance problems, all those kinds of issues. So one of the main challenges people are working with in Scotland is austerity, and doing so much more with so much less. And at the same time, there's a big reorganisation of health and social care, which is being merged. And at the same time as that, there's a recruitment and retention crisis. And there are policy drives to increase evidence-based practice in social services. So this is a challenge because this is often led by assumptions that you can apply what's going on in health to social care when this isn't necessarily the case. So it's a little bit fraught. In the midst of it all, though, this is what we're trying to achieve. So this is my vision for evidence use in social services. And ideally, it would be really nice if everyone working in social services in Scotland wanted to use evidence in the first place and felt in a position to use it, if they knew how to access that information, if they could get hold of the things and knew where it was, and if they were thinking critically about the information and evidence they were engaging in. So those are the kinds of outcomes we're aiming towards. So we're reading really widely because it's important to engage with the LIST literature and the social services literature to look at how evidence and information are used by the community that we're trying to serve, how to design services to meet those needs in ways that achieve outcomes that can be seen as socially just. We're also doing a lot of learning from the people that we're supporting, because although everyone's experience is different and there are a wide range of purposes for which people are wanting to get hold of information and scholarly literature and forms of evidence, there are some common themes about what the barriers are. So what we're really finding is that the library catalogue is really hard to access, really hard to understand. It's complicated to work out how to download a PDF, for example, from a really visually busy website. So those are some of the main challenges for practice that we've been finding. The main one for our users is the accessing paywalled resources, not just in terms of how complicated it is to log into the catalogue when you're not on essentially a campus because it's owned by the NHS. So if you're in an NHS building, then that's simpler. But if you're at home, then it can be quite complicated. The applicability of academic research to practice is also an issue, limited access to digital and information tools. So it's in a lot of kind of different areas and you're trying to deal with a lot of different problems. So some of the challenges are that although this service is brand new, there was a pilot and it was run in health. And applying the strict evidence hierarchies that belong kind of within the health tradition in social care doesn't work in the same way. So the restrictive and prescriptive templates that we were given to work with didn't really work. And the whole system was really built on a passive banking model of instruction. So we thought, sod that, I'm getting rid of it. How might we achieve impact in a way that actually have meaningful results for the workforce? And what approaches can we take to achieve the changes people need to be able to access and use relevant knowledge, and the attitudes that we take towards these different forms of knowledge is really important. So we're working on challenging a lot of the myths perpetuated by library and information services. And all of these myths contribute to perpetuating the same structures of power that have allowed certain models of knowledge to dominate and other voices to not be heard. In the context of social services in Scotland, the government's really focusing on things like co-design, co-production and valuing lived experience, and the knowledge needed to turn these principles into reality doesn't exist in the myths that we deify a lot of the time. So talking to librarians and social services practitioners and reading the literature around evidence searching, I've encountered a lot of myths that the critical librarianship community has been working against for a very long time. Although these myths are useful for professional legitimation in many cases, to make the case that librarians are the experts and library systems are the only place that people can safely go for information, as a way of using power over our users. These myths serve librarians and not the people who need to use research, evidence and information for academic or professional purposes or in their everyday lives. So, for example, insisting on systematic reviews as the gold standard for evidence-based practice is a convenient way to silence the voices of dissent, which are the ones that might not make it into the academic journals in the first place, or the ones that would be rejected by the systematic review methodology. It allows positivist methods and epistemologies to control what approaches and interventions are chosen, and it doesn't allow space for complex understandings of how systems of power in social services and explanations as to why things do or don't work. And how often this isn't based in rationality. People don't always behave in rational ways. We keep myths like Wikipedia shouldn't be used and searching is necessarily and unavoidably complex because they keep us in a job. If we do all the searching for health and social care practitioners, then they'll always need us around. And although I do think there's value in saving the time of the reader, I also think there's more value in empowering people to find and use information themselves rather than gatekeeping it. Librarians are a finite resource. I can't help all 200,000 people working in social services across Scotland. but I can teach a lot of them and provide online learning resources to help them find that information and use it critically themselves. I think it's morally responsible to spend time, rather than running searches and writing summaries for people, to help people who, if they had the agency, might actually find they do have the time, or if we help to organise the information they value and make it more easily discoverable, that would save them a lot of time too. And this is something that NASIG gets, which I was delighted to discover when I was reading the core competencies document. It's something that's incredibly challenged to push back against when dominant models of knowledge generation and evidence-based practice are steamrolling ahead with their ideas about what's valuable. Søren spoke yesterday about the reproducibility crisis, and although it's definitely an issue in science, it can creep into some places where it isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. In social work, for example, you can't hope to reproduce an intervention with a vulnerable child, controlling for all the variables, and anticipate the same outcome as work done with a previous child in a similar situation, because that's not how social work practice works. So it's not how writing and publishing about social work practice can work either. It's also the case in social work, as in many disciplines, that certain topics and voices are trendy and sexy and appealing to government policies and priorities. And it's important to not let those ideologies be the reason that people are using certain approaches, and to be critically engaging when doing evidence searches and summaries to make sure that there are different voices being heard. It's important to listen to the voices of people challenging the science behind the dramatic claims that are being made, suggesting that perhaps it isn't possible or helpful, for example, to quantify young people's trauma and allocate resources people based on a metric of that and estimate their life expectancy based on the degree of their resilience. I'm not sure how that's helpful or useful to anybody. So, as I hope I've illustrated, it's a very political space to be working in, and it can be quite intimidating. And this is where community comes in. So throughout the process of designing the service and in delivering it now, I've not been alone. It's been scary, but having a community who are challenging as well as supportive is incredibly important. I've been able to read their ideas, run my ideas past them, get a sense of whether something's workable or not and what I might have missed. So to put my money where my mouth is, these are some of the approaches I've been trying to take. I wanted to look critically at what it is that we do in reference consultations, evidence searching and summarising that further entrench injustice into the status quo. In this environment, the balance of power is designed by traditional notions of authority, and although there are effective ways to identify which research may be of good quality and which may not be reliable or robust or rigorous, we're trying to encourage people to think about these concepts critically and understand in what contexts authority works in different ways. So when I do evidence searches and summaries, I use tools to look at who's citing who. I try to find and showcase diverse voices. I try to follow what's happening in different areas of social work practice on social media and look at where voices of dissent are coming from and which critical communities are writing work that could be important to be aware of and signpost practitioners too. Excuse me. So a central aspect of critical pedagogy, espoused by people like Paulo Freire and Henry Giroux, is that education shouldn't be about assuming that people don't know things, and that it's important to deposit the information and knowledge you think people should have into them through passive and decontextualised approaches, and hoping that they can parrot it back to you at a test some point later along the line. In work around information literacy to support people in social services to use knowledge, this approach isn't going to work. People need to be able to develop the practices that help them find the information they need and use it in the ways that they need to be able to change the changes they want to see in their services. That might be about writing a report or making a decision about what intervention to use in a complex situation or applying for funding, so all kinds of different purposes. But to do this, people need to be able to use different forms of knowledge, think about it in different ways. And to support this, we need to know what people are doing, what challenges they have with the tools that we're recommending they use through the library systems. And opening up a dialogue in reference consultations is useful for doing that, and in casual conversations that we have with them. Follow-up chats when we've sent them summaries, just to find out what's going on and what they're finding hard, and then hopefully being able to pass that back to systems librarians or people who can change the structures that they're trying to navigate. And I do think we could spend more time considering how we can learn from the people that we're trying to serve, not assuming that they're empty vessels in need of filling, and understanding how they use information to meet their own needs. Reading around information behaviour research can be really interesting in that aspect and give us insight into what people need from information systems. And by taking approaches to service development, like user experience, for example, we can enter into that kind of dialogue with our users. So here's a reading list. the eagle-eyed among you might spot it's all from the same publisher. I really recommend Library Juice Press. I think they're great. And the first book I read was Questioning Library Neutrality, and that's what got me started on this whole thing in 2008, so it's their fault. And the authors of much of this work are still around and active parts of library and information communities, and that's what's really important, that it's not just about passively engaging with their writing, they're part of conversations that are taking place now, and it's really useful to sit down and do the reading, but also be part of the conversations that are taking place about our practice. And one thing that might be vaguely relevant to what you lot do is working on making open access content more understandable. A challenge that we have is that a lot of people need to access social services content that the library system we have access to doesn't subscribe to because it's more health focused. And actually quite a lot of the stuff is published open access through various repositories or just open access generally or as green or whatever. There's also content where some of the issues of the journals that are in the catalogue aren't available. A lot of people working in social services don't know what open access is, and to be honest, why should they a lot of the time, and don't know if they come up against a paywall when they're in the library catalogue, then that isn't necessarily game over. So in the evidence summaries that we're producing, we make sure to link to the DOI of the paywalled version, but also call it that, and be open about what the structures and systems are. If it's paywalled, we're calling it paywalled. If it's open, we're calling it open. And where possible, we link to both versions so that people can access that open access copy wherever available, because also it's published on the internet. It's not just for people with subscriptions and logins through the NHS. It's for anybody who happens upon it. This is a way we can actively use the power we have to support people's understanding of scholarly communication landscapes and to discuss the limitations of paywall content. When it comes to doing one-to-one support, we're going to be talking about this as well, very frankly, where it's interesting to the person that we're trying to support. Try not to rant to them too much. I'm also trying to encourage the library service that we have access to embed open access records into the catalogue, but that's an area that I don't have power over. And all I can do is strategically place information in the line of sight of people who might have the power to affect change over there. Work being done by places like Unpaywall and Open Access Button to make open access content more discoverable and embeddable into library catalogues is really exciting. I'd love to see this adopted. So if anybody has any ideas about how I can convince them to do this, then please let me know. So enough of what I've been doing. What I mean to say in describing some of the ways I've been trying to use theory, research and other people's practice in the communities I'm part of is to give an example of how it's possible to do this kind of work to support more equitable outcomes by transforming how people access and conceptualise different forms of information. For me, it takes the shape of work in searching, summarising and supporting people with information literacy, and for other people it's different things. So I want to preface this with the disclaimer that I know we're all very busy. And that library and information services don't and shouldn't have the power to fix everything. But I think we do have a role to play, and I think we need to think about what our role is. And in case I need to re-emphasise, we have a responsibility to take sides. We need to use our power for good, and we need to not let our privilege let us walk away because something doesn't affect us personally and it's too challenging to change how things are. Because if things are bad for people who don't have the same kind of agency that we do, then that's not fair. We have a responsibility to do something about that. And I think we've got much more of a chance of actually achieving change by working together. So here are some things I think we can do, some examples of what's already going on. We can be part of a wider community and learn from the expertise of others. I think it's really great to see here at NASIG people doing exactly this. And it's made me wonder about how much we're actually talking to each other across different parts of the profession, because I have so much to learn from systems librarians, for example, about how things work. And I think, you know, this is an example of how we can learn from each other in these different areas across systems, instruction and research. We all have insights into different parts of the puzzle. And I wonder how much we can work together within our institutions or across multidisciplinary communities to communicate with each other about what the challenges are and what the solutions could be to making information more accessible for our users. And as an information professional who tries to help people in social services work to use evidence, it helps to understand scholarly communication processes and challenges. And I learn these issues from professional colleagues within the communities that I'm part of. At the moment, for example, I've got no idea about negotiating contracts at all. I just know that I don't have access to the things that I need access to, and the people that I'm trying to help don't have access to things. So I know I need to understand more to be able to advocate effectively for my users. And in the Scottish context, I don't know if we've actually tried negotiating lately. I know I'm not a subscriptions expert, so I don't know when I'm out of line for suggesting things to people who are in charge of the subscriptions that I want. I do know what content will be valuable, though, for my service users, and I know that we have a limited budget, but I don't know how realistic it is to hope for anything better. I know somewhere out there, people like you are working hard for your communities to have more access at lower prices. So how do we work to learn together to negotiate effectively and make reasonable requests? Seriously, please help. But engaging with people who work in this area and think and write about these kinds of things has given me a bit of an insight into potential areas that we can work on to negotiate with vendors. And Lisa Hinchcliffe recently wrote an article for Scholarly Kitchen that I thought was really interesting on library subscriptions. And I don't know how realistic this idea is about putting open content into the user workflow and using it as leverage for better pricing. So if anybody has thoughts about that afterwards, I'd love to hear them. So on the topic of openness, I think another thing that is really important for us to do is to practice what we preach in terms of how we treat information as a profession, about our profession. For example, in 2014, CILIP, which is the Chartered Institute for Library and Information Professionals in the UK, commissioned a workforce diversity study. And the data set for this was promised, but it was never delivered. And recently, DILON, which is Diversity in Libraries of the North, which is a very small and brand new kind of group, have been putting pressure on for this data to be made available. So there's a petition, basically, that was already existing on the CILIP website, and people have been encouraged to sign that and register an interest in the data being opened up. Because it's really important to be able to see that data, to adequately name the problem that we have in diversity in library and information science work and services work. And if we can't name the problem, we can't realistically hope to do anything about it. And in the context of this particular data, we know to an extent how to name the problem. It's massive underrepresentation of diversity in the UK library profession. You know, it's mostly white, mostly middle-class people. And we really need to do something about that. I know it's an issue in the States, but seriously, in the UK, it's big. It's not just about getting people in, though. It's about retention and creating the conditions to make people want to be able to stay and to allow them to stay working in the profession, which is influenced by structural issues like pay, contract length, flexibility, which all connects to wider issues of equity in education and recruitment methods too. So how can we use our power and agency to make a difference here? I think the privileged among us need to be kicking up more of a stink and working together to make sure our hiring practices are equitable, for example. And I know it's not necessarily relevant to all of you, but in some cases you have control over hiring practices, and this, you know, there's lots of reading around this that we can all be engaging with. There's lots of good material about how we can make a change. A great source of information, as I've mentioned, is DILON, who are working hard to advocate for POC, BME, non-white library and information workers in the north of England, and talk about issues of recruitment and retention more widely. And to get anywhere with representation, we need to be looking, as a profession, acknowledging when we've made missteps or mistakes through privilege and ignorance, even when, and especially when it's accidental. Even though professional organisations and bodies don't usually intend to cause harm, they have many opportunities to do it. For example, the CILIP Wales conference recently held a diversity panel. I don't know how well you can see this photo. That's a full white diversity panel. It's mostly men. And it's not representative of the library and information workforce. It's not a good optic, and it's not something you want to see reproduced. We don't know what the rationale was behind it, but we do know that there were lots of complaints during and following the panel taking place. And in this situation, CILIP had the power to own its mistake, acknowledge the damage caused, and learn from how they chose to use this power and the platform they were offering. And to the best of my knowledge, this hasn't happened, and hopefully things will be different in the future. But it's not a good look. And as I've mentioned, I think we need to resist some of the dodgy stuff that's being brought into libraries in the name of self-preservation. And in many ways, we're slowly undermining our own values by doing this. We need to look at the power that we have and think about how we're using it and how we should be using it. And sometimes what happens in a lot of the talks I give is people say, oh, that was interesting, very utopian. That was really nice, but it's all unrealistic. And then I go away and cry. But as I mentioned, there is this suggestion that we don't have the power to do anything. And I don't think that's true. And to illustrate, I've got a few examples of things that are going on in the UK that people are doing things with the power that they have. So, a current example of this in the UK is a scheme for visa applications in public libraries. I don't know if anybody's heard about it. This is a statement from Libraries Connected, who used to be called the Society of Chief Librarians, about what the contract entails. And it's evident from this that they're under the impression it will somehow increase library use or somehow reflect well on public libraries. and people will bring their documentation along and maybe go for a stroll in the shelves afterwards and borrow a book. But it has massive implications for people's lives, and perhaps, you know, it's not going to go the way they think it's going to go. SCL's been awarded a subcontract for the delivery of digital biometric visa support services led by Sopra Steria. And again, I don't know if you've heard about them. They don't have a great reputation. The UK-wide contract covers digital contact centre and physical service points throughout the UK. And local libraries are going to provide convenient and welcoming community service points, which applicants can visit in person with their documentation and enjoy all the other facilities libraries offer. So there are 56 regional library services involved in this. And I don't think it's evidence-based. I don't think it's been strategically thought through. I don't think it stands a chance of actually achieving the things that they hope it might. Not that we know what they really are, because it hasn't been communicated what the purpose of this is. I think it's reactive and desperate and actively harmful to the public library brand, and to the public library workers who are expected to do this work. And for a bit of context, the SCL represents heads of library services in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And library management in the UK is increasingly left to people whose grounding isn't public libraries. They've come in from a management background. So they're not familiar with the ethics and values of librarianship. And I think this is where we're seeing increasing problems in terms of library strategies and policies. So this subcontract is about visa support, which sounds harmless, but in reality could be much darker. And the company behind it has a track record of gross information mismanagement of people's private data, as well as unethical employment practices. And I'm not confident that this is the kind of power that public libraries want to be aligning with or wielding themselves. So on Twitter we started chatting about this a little, and it transpired that this wasn't news to everybody. So this is a public librarian who was talking about how they were told that they would be expected to do this in their public library, but that they were banned from talking about it to even their family and friends. There haven't been many answers from the SCL about what's going on. And this isn't the first time that library staff have been actively silenced and banned from talking about ethically dubious policies and practices in public libraries in the UK. It's happened in the context of public library closures for about a decade, and has resulted in library workers being afraid to speak up for fear of being sacked, and library campaigners doing what they can to amplify the message about local library closures, but ultimately it being too late to do anything, and not enough to successfully prevent closures, or libraries being handed over to volunteers, and then ultimately closing anyway. So it's apparently this situation for public library workers. They don't have much power at all, and they don't have a platform to get the message out there. So to try and raise attention around the issue, it was suggested the Radical Librarians Collective could put together an open letter condemning the activity. So this is what the Librarians Collective is about. It's a space to challenge, provoke and improve and develop the communications between like-minded individuals around library information issues, and to galvanise collective solidarity, particularly against the marketisation of libraries and the removal of agency. So they collectively put together a statement condemning the deal, which was agreed upon by people contributing to a Sandstorm document and on the RLC JISC mailing list. And one of the key messages within the statement is that it isn't appropriate to put library workers in situations like this, to force them to hold a power over people that they don't want and shouldn't have, and that isn't within the ethics of librarianship to wield. And specific concerns include these. That it's not right to have library workers as agents of the application process. It undermines the role of libraries and librarians as trusted spaces. It's counter to our professional ethics and puts a strain on already under-resourced library workers. And further mishandling of data by Sopra Steria could easily negatively impact libraries because we don't have control over their crappy systems. And to be honest, even if we did, we probably wouldn't know what to do with it. It also suggests that alternative ways we should be wielding our power in public libraries. If we really want to do something to support immigrants, we need to support public library services that meet their needs, and the current funding situation nationally doesn't allow for the creation of these conditions. And throughout this open letter, the people who've been contributing to writing it have cited their sources, because they're good librarians. The objection to this scheme has been informed by evidence about the history of the companies involved, the history and ethos of public libraries, as well as critical awareness of what the likely outcomes are for the communities public libraries are supposed to be serving. So far, the letter's gained a good amount of attention and the issues achieving reach. Whether it will have an impact on anything is yet to be seen, but it is an example of how working as a community and being critical and raising issues of power imbalances can be heard more loudly than doing it individually, especially when it's actively prevented. Even if this isn't enough power, I think it's the right thing to do. It's an example of a wide range of library and information people coming together to write something and amplify an issue that isn't happening in their place of work or within their area of specialism, but it's a matter of the public good. This activity is something that's likely to stifle the public's use of public resources, and that's not okay. We have a responsibility to do what we can to challenge that. Although this is a public library example, and I'm not talking to a public library crowd, I'm sure you can think of examples where private companies are reaching into your services in uncomfortable ways that might have friction with library values and the public interest. Okay, so another great example of how power is being wielded collectively in library and information communities around the UK is patron privacy and security in public libraries. So in the US, Alison McCreena runs the Library Freedom Project, and she inspired people in the UK to do a similar thing to support public libraries to engage with digital privacy and security. And Scottish Pen, who's a writers' organisation, produced a toolkit for public libraries, and Nick, who works for Scottish Pen, delivers workshops across Scotland in public libraries on things like threat modelling, passphrases, corporate surveillance, ad blockers, web browsing safety, HTTPS, VPNs, device encryption, Tor, anonymous web browsing, secure communications, file sharing and storage, physical security. Honestly, something in there for everybody. And I think this is a great example of people working around library and information services, helping library and information services out. And I do have to point out that Nick, who's the person behind this, isn't a library worker, although his partner is, so I think that might have something to do with it. He's part of Scottish Pen, an organisation for writers that focuses on freedom of expression. But he's a wonderful ally for librarians and wants to use his expertise to support library workers, in turn to support the public. And then there's Ode, who's an incredible public librarian who's really been able to jump on the privacy train because it's something that she really cares about and has had the freedom in her workplace to do, so she's based in Newcastle. But that's not the case for everybody in the UK. Lots of public librarians are really keen to support this kind of work in their libraries and do it themselves, but library management aren't often keen because they view libraries as neutral spaces where this kind of work shouldn't be taking place. So it's great that people are taking the opportunities that they do have, and through this growing community of like-minded people, that reach is slowly increasing to help people develop an understanding of privacy and security and to make changes to their information practices to help with this. Okay, so I've talked about a whole load of areas of library and information work that were hopefully vaguely interesting, but possibly you're wondering, right, but what can I do in my own work? So as well as some of this being something that you can contribute your own expertise to in different ways, to help communities of praxis be well-rounded and representative of the whole kind of diverse skill set we have in our profession, here's some homework. If you're interested in where praxis and critical engagement in systems librarianship can take place and what it can look like, then this is definitely a book chapter for you. It's written by Simon Barron and Andrew Preeter, who are two UK librarians working in academic libraries. And they've written a fantastic chapter on the technical side of library and information work that even I, as a non-systems person who's very unfamiliar with how things work, could understand. And it covers lots of different areas, including the relationship between libraries and system suppliers, insecurity of library management systems, privacy and surveillance of patrons, open source software, the distribution of labour and work around this, and algorithmic bias of discovery layers. And it does a really great job of explaining power imbalances in these contexts and what could be done about them. So, for example, they write about Angela Galvin's writing about how tools like Summon prioritise the results from certain content over others, and Matthew Reedsma's study into how algorithmic biases in library discovery layers reinforce existing social inequalities, and how bias in the algorithm, which is programmed by humans, reflects the biases of wider society against marginalised communities. There are specific biases against women, the LGBT community, Islam, and mental illness. Although we often assume search results are reflecting the scholarly conversation and showing it in order of most to least relevant to whom, research seems to suggest this isn't always the case. These are the same kinds of inequalities in search results seen from search engines like Google. I'm sure many of you will be well acquainted with Sophia Noble's extensive and evidence-based research on algorithms and her book Algorithms of Oppression, where she writes about how data discrimination takes the shape of retrieving search results on topics like black girls that are not at all fair or unbiased representations of black girls. And these are the same kinds of power imbalances and biases at play in wider society. Just as when we make the decision to listen to what people need and want from our catalogues, search tools and research support through methods like ethnography, user experience and person-centred approaches, we're able to see where research processes stall or break down completely. When we're able to make the decision to critically examine the tools and systems we provide access to and thereby sanction, we're able to see where there needs to be change in the power dynamic. And I feel like this is a really good jumping off point to encourage people to spend some time thinking about how and where power works in the areas of their own work and what role they can play in making things better. And I don't, as I say, I don't feel well placed to tell you to suck eggs, so I'm not going to make suggestions. I do, however, hope you check out Simon and Andrew's chapter, which I've linked to in this presentation, and wider reading, and pick up some ideas. So, in rounding up slightly early because I spoke too fast, what I'm really suggesting is that we have huge potential to find the power that we have and use it. And although that can be pretty daunting, none of us are alone. If you see a problem and want to contribute to fixing the problem, there's very likely people out there who want that too. So let's make the most of our information-seeking prowess, go out and find out about the issues of injustice in our areas of work, and find those communities to go and kick some ass with. Thank you. If anybody has any questions or any points to make, we've got loads of time. Please. Hi.
Just make a quick comment.
Yep.
Very quickly. Just thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation. My name's Emily Farrell. I work for De Gruyter, so I'm on the publisher's side. And I have to say that just what you mentioned about dialogue is so important, and I think that speaking to publishers about how things can change is also an incredibly important thing to do. So just thank you.
Do you have any ideas about how we can do that and how that works well?
Ooh.
Asking you a question now.
Well, to be put on the spot. Look, I think that what you say about data sharing, I think, is something that could be. I mean, I don't necessarily have a great example, but I think that we could certainly. There could be more discussion about how publishers can share what they know with librarians to improve the state of access and accessibility. Simple things as well, like we hadn't had a VPAT done for our platform, and because of requests from librarians and questions of why we hadn't done that yet, we now do. So we have an analysis of accessibility on our platform, and that the gaps in that are propelling change, which I think is, so small example, but I think that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the discussions about accessibility in the library community are pushing us to pay more attention to it. So that's one thing I can think of.
So the more those issues are amplified within the library and information community, the more from the publishing side that's heard.
I think so.
Great.
I mean, I think, as you say, collectively you have a lot of power. So push us to do better. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to say that I really love the presentation, was deeply informed by it, and deeply reflecting on my power and privilege and praxis in the work that I do as an acquisitions librarian. And I'm actually going to talk about that in a little bit. So I guess what I have come across is a kind of dismissiveness of publishers when I talk about these challenges. I have engaged in conversations with, say, ProQuest, for example, who has control over quite a lot of primary resources. Mm-hmm. And I have asked them, what will it take? Name your price to make available primary resources that you have trapped behind a perpetual paywall. Uh-huh. There's no expansion on this historical information. You know, you've got your set. How will you release it? And you know, I get chuckles. So
From the publishers?
Yes. And so I just want for us to use our collective power to constantly, in conversations of negotiation, be pressing our publishers for distributors. What will it take to? What's the dollar amount? What's the licensing right? What do you want in order to make information accessible? And you know, since I do acquisitions and licensing, there's an opportunity there at the point of purchase or the point of renewal to ask that question. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to ask that question. Use a little bit of your political power to do so, but also. Keep that conversation going. So when they come to visit, my sales reps know I'm going to ask you, what are you doing to make information available, and you know, tell me what's the price. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Adolfo Triangle, University of British Columbia. Again, more commentary rather than a question, but you might.
In this instance, I'm welcoming it.
Yeah. So within the, and hopefully my colleagues from Canada can, if I'm not articulating this as well, hopefully they can do it. There's a lot of work right now in Canada about reaching out to Indigenous communities and building, of course, many. Better relationships with First Nations, just given the history of what's happened in Canada and, of course, paralleled in the United States and stuff. But I think, speaking to the publisher who asked about, one of the things is scholarship and ways of communicating knowledge for Indigenous community is very different than the Western way. And so I think publishers need to be open to the fact that maybe publications that are coming from those groups, and not just in Canada, but across the world, Indigenous populations, is not going to look the same as traditional Western scientific peer-reviewed process, and to be open to publishing those materials so that that gives more visibility, and that scholarship and way of knowing is transmitted for those communities. Also for libraries, thinking about how that different way of organizing knowledge is sometimes in contrast with Western ways of organizing knowledge. Just an example is Library of Congress subject headings don't quite reflect, and sometimes are very offensive to Indigenous populations. And I think we need to work a lot toward fixing some of those things up and learning to deal with, for example, subject headings. We look to this thing called literary warrant to justify headings, which of course with societies that build most of their knowledge around oral traditions, there is nothing written down, right? You know, there are ceremonies, and we just need to learn how to incorporate that so that we can appropriately describe the materials that other non-Western societies provide. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Just commentary, but
thank you. And I see a lot of parallels there with what's happening in terms of grey literature as well, and lived experience in areas. You know, for example, in Scotland, Gypsy traveller communities in Scotland have different traditions of sharing knowledge, and if you want to work in a co-producing way with those communities, then you need to respect and listen to and give authority to their knowledge that they've communicated differently.
Hi.
Hello.
I was in line before Hank, so yeah. I'm not trying to hone in. But anyway, my name is Susan Davis. I'm at the University at Buffalo, where we have several health sciences schools, medical school, dental school, nursing, pharmacy, etc., where, as your one slide said, systematic reviews are now becoming the coin of the realm in terms of tenure, and librarians are participating
yes.
in those publications, and they have become a significant time investment for those librarians who are liaisons to those schools. So I wanted to ask you to expand a bit more about, you know, systematic reviews and that approach, and it's sort of like, again, the whole tenure structure values these, but if they are becoming like, whoa, elitist or something like that, what ideas do you have about some maybe other approaches in that area?
I think there are multiple ways of approaching doing systematic reviews that can be inclusive of literature that would otherwise not be included or not make it through to shortlisting. Because, for example, what we see a lot in research in social care is that you can only do experimental studies on certain topics. And people are trying to do systematic reviews where the nature of the research isn't experimental. So the theoretical frameworks that are used aren't always articulated or articulated in the same way. And you can't map that knowledge and the kind of metadata about how an individual study's been conducted. It doesn't map across to another one, even if they're very similar. Or whoever's published it hasn't really described something within the methodology, so you have to discount it, even though it's potentially an incredibly valuable, in-depth, qualitative study of people's experiences of incarceration and being separated from their child, for example, or, you know, something like how social workers can sensitively approach issues where there's child abuse concerns in ways that don't further damage, you know, and cause harm to the child or the non-abusive parent or carer. And if you try to answer a research question that can't be answered by a systematic review methodology or one that's very strict, then you're really limiting what knowledge is then given authority and value in the policy context. So if you can take a methodology that's more accepting of more wishy-washy research, you know, it's still high quality, it's just not valued and labelled in the same way, then that's a really important thing to do. And it's not reproducible. But is that what you're looking for? Or are you looking to solve an immediate problem with the best evidence that's available at that time? I hope that's answered your question a little bit. Hank.
Hello, it's
Hi.
good to see you again.
And you.
We had breakfast together this morning. Aldolfo touched on part of what I was wanting to bring up, which I'm a cataloger, and of course subject headings are always a problem. But I'm wondering what other parts of metadata creation do you think we could improve on to help marginalized communities? Because we have this concept that we're trying to be neutral, but like you said, when you're neutral, you're just supporting the majority.
Yeah.
What other areas do you think we could improve on?
I don't know if it's something that cataloguers have control over, but things like within discovery layers, what gets ranked as something that's valuable or relevant. So maybe there's aspects of metadata that could bump up the relevance of, you know, less prestigious forms of knowledge. And it's about what gets into the catalogue in the first place as well, I think. So a lot of the time, you know, a lot of open access content isn't in the catalogue, so people don't know it's there and available. But if it's an open access journal that's of a very high quality, you know, you're never going to find that. So it's about what makes it into the catalogue in the first place.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jill Power. I'm a product manager at EBSCO. Some of you might have been at the lightning round yesterday. I was talking a little bit about what we're doing at EBSCO for accessibility. And the reason I wanted to say is that all of that came from you guys. Every one of you asking your sales rep, your account rep, saying, what are you doing about accessibility? That's what pushed us to make all of those changes. And in turn, we are talking to our publishers. What are you guys doing to help us get more accessible? So I just want to let you know your collective power. I mean, all of you together are very powerful, whether you're in a group, and there are a lot of groups out there that focus on accessibility and making, usability, making everybody access to the same information, whether it's individually, you asking your reps or account managers, or together in a group. Every single one of you have a word and a power in this, and it is affecting the industry. So I want you to know that, and it does take some time for us to get all of these changes, but from that standpoint, we are working on it. We hear you. Continue to be loud and heard. That's all I have to say, and thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, very inspiring.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Steve Kelly from Wake Forest University. I have a question for you about your discussion about including marginalized voices and not necessarily emphasizing peer-reviewed science and things like that. And that got me to thinking about how do you negotiate the line between communities that have been unfairly, excluded from the discussion with, relatively harmless things like flat eartherism, which can mislead people, can kind of look like science, the problem of pseudoscience, and then we also have a problem with political forces, weaponizing misinformation. I don't know if you're familiar with the American figure Alex Jones, who's done terrible things, calling the Sandy Hook massacre a staged event and things like that. How do you negotiate marginalized for
good reasons?
Good reasons.
It's really difficult because peer review can be a really useful heuristic. You can go, oh, it's been peer reviewed, therefore it's reliable, but that's not necessarily the case, which you see when peer-reviewed research is redacted, or when it turns out that a scientific study's missed the decimal point by a factor of 1,000, so the findings are completely skewed. So I think it's about this information literacy and about teaching people to be critical and not being scared to not be neutral when it comes to that and say, look, these are the voices of power, and here's how you can think about who's saying it and why, and have a look at them and see whether they really are being silenced or whether they're being silenced on a massive multinational platform, and whose voices aren't there in the mainstream, and which ones you can maybe start looking into in more depth and be really inquisitive and go and look further and find your truth or whatever.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amber Billy from Bard College, and fabulous talk, just really great. And this is more of a comment to the conversation that we've been having on what catalogers can do. And I think we really, as catalogers, as librarians, we need to push back against those dominant structures of power. We need to push back on Library of Congress, and we need to fork from Library of Congress and no longer use them as the dominant, source of all of our subject access, and create communities of subject access for specific underrepresented domains. And we need to have our cataloging cooperatives, like the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, embrace other thesauri taxonomy classifications that would bring to light those underrepresented populations. We can also leverage linked data to draw the semantics between the taxonomies, so that if you use one word but I use another, our systems can still find them. So we need to encourage our vendors to create those systems. So we have a lot we can do, and we need to challenge this structure that we've had throughout the 20th and late 19th century, and leverage the technology that we have at hand.
Great, thank you. I can already see how that would be really useful in the kind of work that I'm doing, because in different countries we call things different things in the context of social care and provision and the approaches that are being taken. So something's called one thing in the States and it's called a different thing in the UK, but it's the same practice that's taking place. And I don't even know what it's called in non-Western cultures that are doing similar services. So if I could find that without having to identify what it's called in the first place, because if I don't know how to name it, I don't know how to search for it, then that would be really helpful for widening the picture. Thank you.
Hi, so I completely agree that our models for who we recognize as authorities really need to be challenged, and we don't necessarily have the answers to what are the alternatives to, say, peer review. I think questions like, who do we count as our peers? Are they the same people in the room? Are they people that look like us? Are they people that have been educated like us? We're going to keep choosing ourselves, and we're going to keep making the same decision. So I completely agree, and we need to raise those questions. And in the interest of, in our shared interest for dialogue, I guess I kind of want to throw out a little question, a little challenge, reflecting back on the opening speaker Friday night. I'm not sure if you were here for that.
Yes.
So thinking about our opening speaker Friday night, and then thinking about all the visionary speakers for this year's NASIG. I was just kind of wondering, what are your thoughts? Because it seems like, and I'm making a huge assumption, I recognize this, it seems like a lot of, or all of the speakers are all white. Half of them are European, and we're very much, we're very Western dominated in our thinking, in our scholarship, in the teaching that we do, the scholars that we raise, and it's really problematic. So I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts were about speaker selection.
I, this morning, had a giant case of imposter syndrome, or I thought, who the hell am I to be standing up here talking about privilege? What's going, hey, thanks for the platform that you've given me on account of my privilege. And I don't really know what to do about that, beyond reaching out further. I was really privileged and really honoured to be asked to come because I'm not part of the NASIG community, and it was exciting to be given the opportunity to talk about this in a multidisciplinary kind of context. But yeah, it did make me wonder what right I had to be here. I don't know if anybody else felt that kind of tension when they were invited to speak, so I can only speak for myself. But yeah, it's probably a good idea to diversify who's invited to speak and talk. You're absolutely right. Can somebody say a nice thing now, please? Thanks, Billy.
You're welcome. I just think, to respond, it's like, we first have to acknowledge the problem, right?
Yeah.
And admit of what's happening, and we are doing that as a profession. We're saying, like, hey, hashtag critlib, hashtag critcat, hashtag, I guess, chrissys systems, whatever. Anyway, we're acknowledging, we're working, and now we need to step aside and, let other people speak.
But also find them in the first place and make the effort to go looking. So Dylan, for example, the Diversity in Libraries of the North, have a page on their website that's like, are you a non-white library information professional or person working in this area? Do you want to do some talking? Here's a list. Here's what their expertise is in. So these lists are being produced now, and we can use that as a place, because even if, we don't know how to reach outside of our own little bubbles, then those lists are being produced. So that's a really positive first step.
Hello, Ted Westervelt. Let me follow up as a white male from the Library of Congress. I'd just like to go back one step to just about the concept of access to great literature. In the conversation, I think, and there are probably people who have more cataloging experience than I do, is that it's, I think, the subject that will get you there. Subjects theoretically are less, descriptive metadata, i.e., title of a famous journal, which is paywalled, that will possibly rise to the top. With the subjects, theoretically, if they all have the same subject, theoretically, they should rise. I think this gets into the point, and I'd like to sort of touch on what Amber said, was the Library of Congress subject headings. I will take a stand that I think there's value there. I think they should be partnered with other things. To build upon that, to work with that. I'm not going to pretend it's a large bureaucratic organization, moves slowly and is not generally on the cutting edge, but the hope is that if other places are, it does tend to follow, and it does have then the weight to hopefully push good initiatives or help provide its bulk to the initiatives in the right direction. So I will not speak on behalf of the organization, would be interested just to see the new thesaurus, the new subject terminology, revisiting, rethinking that, and then how that could then, tie in so that maybe pull the Queen Mary in the right direction would be interesting. But the other thing I'll say, and I really will make a plug for the Library of Congress, is it's the National Library. It's not just sort of your standard scholarly publications. It's the gray literature, which are important, and there's a large focus on trying to collect as much as possible. It's easier to get the standard publications in because they're distributed well, it's easy to get them. But there is a real emphasis. There are a lot of people that do attempt to go out and reach these communities. I've been involved in a very small one, which I know a lot of colleagues here have been doing more on, but we've started a small zine collection. We're trying to get that going, which collects, I think, underrepresented or slightly marginalized voices. One thing that I've been attempting to do, really, one of my small soapboxes is we're there with the National Library, marginalized communities. We like to reach out to you. We can provide guidance on how to create digital resources. We can preserve your digital resources. It is sort of a national institution that really is for everybody, and we'd like to, I know that everything's sort of baked into the cake for a long time, but there is sort of an impetus to take advantage, and at least in the theory of the place, it could be for everybody. We want it to be for everybody. It won't be easy, but the basic bottom line of it is we can make it another, I think, large national institutions. The principles on which they're founded are good ones, and if we work, we're pushing towards something that theoretically they should be aimed at. So this may be a little too optimistic, but hopefully that's correct.
But it's great that there's interest in doing that. Thank you. Dude, can
it's
you
me
make
again.
it really quick? Because I need to pee so bad.
Oh, okay. I'm sort of responding to Ted's comment, and it's especially on, and so pardon the specificity of getting into subject headings and stuff. I think this is one of the challenges of dealing with controlled vocabularies, is that we're reflecting a certain community, and sometimes those communities are coming from very different perspectives. And I think with the subject headings, for example, in Canada, different approaches are being taken. Some institutions have said, we're going to totally replace, for example, Indians of North America with whatever the term is. Understanding that even the term they picked is not necessarily universally accepted by the First Nations communities, right? It is a compromise. And I think, me personally, I kind of think I agree with a little bit of what Ted was saying, was in a sense of we need to understand that those are windows from both directions. When we have a body of knowledge that uses one term that's inappropriate or not the right term used by a different, that term still exists. We still, in some ways, still have to use that term because we need to provide this community a gateway to the knowledge that's being tagged in by this community. And so I think one of these things is understanding that we need to make these, I don't want to use the word compromise, but integration, that it's not a either or potentially, but in fact a complementary, figuring out how do we use the system's complementary, understanding that we need to work on those that particularly are offensive. But I think that we are reflecting different communities that need that do have different ways of viewing the world, and they're both valid. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really not kidding.
Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to thank Paige for her comment earlier, and I just know that as an organization where it's our board, for example, is primarily white members, I just know that we need to do a little better in being very intentional about this, about not creating a white image of authority, and we also need to make sure that we're not relying on members of color to bring this up and do this work for us. So I know we still have some work to do. I just really want to say I value that comment. So thank you, Paige.
Well, thank you, Lauren. We appreciate it. Thanks. I just have a couple housekeeping announcements, but let's give her a round of applause for a very engaging presentation.